On a cold February morning in 1903, the town of Roanoke still slept under a blanket of mist that crept from the Blue Ridge Mountains like a ghost refusing to leave the earth. The cobblestone streets glistened from last night's rain, and the church bell rang once, a sound that drifted through the fog like a warning lost in time. No one noticed the man standing near the train station that morning, a tall figure dressed in an immaculate black coat and a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders straight, face unreadable. His name was Henry Wraith. To the people who had known him years ago, he was a polite, well-spoken gentleman, the kind who never raised his voice and paid for his whiskey without counting the coins. But beneath that quiet courtesy lived something darker, something that breathed in silence and fed on human weakness. The story of Henry Wraith does not begin with blood. It begins with charm. When he first arrived in Virginia in 1899, Wraith was a man of ambition. He carried a leather suitcase filled with well-ironed shirts, notes on local trading routes, and a single photograph of a woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out. He spoke to the townsfolk with courteous warmth, asking about crops, business, and the price of land. He shook hands firmly, remembered names quickly, and smiled with precision. People said he was the kind of man who could talk a banker into giving him credit just for the pleasure of his company. Yet, those who shared a drink with him often mentioned one strange thing: his eyes. Grey as gunmetal, reflective and distant, they seemed to watch not the person before him, but something behind them, something ordinary folk could never see. That February morning, Henry Wraith had returned, not as a businessman but as something else entirely. His cane tapped against the pavement in slow rhythm as he walked toward the town center. Every tap echoed like a countdown. By mid-morning he stood before the old butcher's shop owned by Harold Gentry, a man known for his temper and debts. Wraith entered quietly, the bell above the door chiming once. He greeted Harold with a faint smile and a question that would mark the beginning of Virginia's most unsettling chapter. "Tell me," Wraith said, "how much do you think a man's soul is worth?" Harold laughed at first, thinking it a joke, but Henry didn't. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as he explained that every man had a price, not just for the things he owned, but for the weight of his past. It's unclear what exactly was said during that conversation, but by evening, Harold Gentry locked his shop early, muttering nonsense as he stumbled home. The next morning, he was found dead behind his house, sitting upright with a ledger in his hands and a coin placed inside his mouth. The sheriff wrote it off as madness fueled by debt. But others whispered that Harold hadn't been the same since Wraith's visit. Some claimed his eyes had lost their color. Others said he'd spent the night staring at nothing, repeating a single phrase over and over. He took it. He took it. From that day forward, Henry Wraith was no longer just another name in the parish records. He became a presence, seen but not understood. A week later, Wraith paid a visit to the widow of Major Harlan, a woman who had kept herself distant since her husband's mysterious disappearance 2 winters prior. Witnesses said she met him cordially and served tea in the parlor. That evening, the lights in her house went out. They stayed out for 3 days straight. When finally someone knocked at her door, they found her alive, though changed, silent, pale, and unable to speak. Each time someone mentioned Henry Wraith, she trembled as if the name carried an unbearable weight. But the town was small, and silence doesn't last long in small towns. Whispers began to spread about Henry's ledger, said to contain the names of those he'd purchased, about the old silver coin he carried and placed in the mouths of those he visited. Some said it was payment for something unseen. Others believed Wraith had studied medicine in Europe and used hypnosis to drive people mad. The truth, however, was simpler and far more disturbing. Henry Wraith understood people with surgical precision. He could sense regret, guilt, longing, the fractures beneath a man's facade. And once he found those cracks, he didn't fill them. He widened them, slowly and deliberately, until their entire sense of self collapsed. His crimes were not swift. They were intimate. And so, piece by piece, the story of Roanoke began to unravel. By spring, Wraith had become a myth walking among men. He attended church regularly, always sitting in the same pew, always listening with head bowed. Each sermon seemed to amuse him. People said he would smile when the pastor spoke of redemption. No one dared ask why. But behind closed doors, the sheriff's office began compiling notes. 6 disappearances in 2 months, all of them connected to debts, quarrels, or secrets people had tried to bury. Henry's name appeared in every record, sometimes as a witness, sometimes merely rumored nearby. One name on the list stood out: Thomas Hale, a local painter who had once sold portraits to the mayor's family. His last known commission was for Henry Wraith himself. Thomas disappeared the day he delivered the painting. When investigators found the canvas weeks later, the figure in it looked almost lifelike, except that the eyes were missing, replaced with shades of grey paint mixed thickly, almost like ash. The townsfolk began locking their doors before sunset. The sound of Wraith's cane tapping against the pavement became a nightmare mothers whispered about to their children. But even then, Henry was seen often, walking calmly through the central square. Never hurried, always polite. He left no fingerprints, no debts, no paper trail. Only silence and fear. They called him the gentleman who collected souls. Little did they know the real horror had only begun. By the time April arrived, Roanoke had changed. The town that once buzzed with trade and chatter had turned nervous, as if the air itself carried unspoken dread. The train station, once alive with travelers and gossip, stood quieter now. People avoided eye contact, conversations were whispered, and the mere echo of polished shoes on cobblestone was enough to make curtains twitch. Henry Wraith walked those same streets with calm indifference, his black hat shading his face from the spring sun. To the casual observer, he was an elegant man, always courteous, always tipping his hat to ladies passing by. Yet to those who'd watched long enough, there was something chilling in the precision of his gestures. Every movement seemed measured, deliberate, as if he knew more about the world around him than the world wished to know about him. Sheriff Amos Breyer, a broad man with weary eyes and more patience than the town credited him for, had started keeping a personal journal, a record of everything strange that had happened since Wraith returned. Each page was written in small, careful handwriting, names, dates, small details that might connect one tragedy to another. He didn't believe in ghosts or devils. He believed in people, in bad choices, in dark hearts. But Henry Wraith, he troubled him. For 3 nights Breyer sat in his office with the same question circling his thoughts. What did Wraith want? Not wealth. He seemed to have enough of that. Not land. He showed no interest in property. It was something more abstract, psychological, spiritual even. It was as if Henry collected not objects, but the remnants of broken people. Breyer's suspicions deepened when he found a note left anonymously at his door one morning. A single sheet of cream-colored paper, finely cut, sealed with wax, and written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand. If you seek Henry Wraith, you will not find him in the daylight. He resides where remorse lingers, where a man fears his own reflection. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost beautiful. Breyer kept the note in his vest pocket from that day forward, reading it again whenever he felt the storm in his chest build up. Meanwhile, in the heart of town, fear began to evolve into obsession. Conversations in barbershops and taverns circled the same theme. Who would be next? Some swore they'd seen Wraith watching them from across the street, though when they looked again he was gone. Others claimed he was a doctor experimenting with the mind, using suggestion to control people's thoughts. But the truth was uglier. It required no hypnotism, only manipulation. Among those most affected was Martha Cray, a young widow who worked as a seamstress on Jefferson Street. Martha had lost her husband to illness years ago, and though she was quiet, she had the kind of steady resolve that others admired. One evening, Henry Wraith entered her shop. He placed his hat gently on the counter and asked her to mend a tear in the lining of his coat. As she worked, he complimented her craftsmanship, spoke softly about the burden of loneliness, about how some people faded not because they were forgotten, but because they allowed others to take their will away. Martha felt, for the first time in years, seen over the next few weeks, Wraith returned often, sometimes with small items that needed fixing, a glove, a collar, a loose button. Each visit lasted longer than it should have, and each time his words sliced gently at the fragile threads of Martha's peace. He asked about her late husband, about whether she still felt his presence. By the 5th visit, Martha began to dream of the man in the black hat even when she was awake. She said his voice stayed with her after he left, whispering over the sound of her sewing machine. By the end of May, Martha Cray stopped coming to church. When Briar sent a deputy to check on her, he found the shop empty, all the sewing neatly arranged, the door unlocked. On the work table lay Wraith's coat, perfectly folded, and inside its pocket a small piece of paper torn from a hymnal with a single verse underlined. The ink was still fresh. It read, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Sheriff Briar knew then that Henry Wraith wasn't going to be caught by ordinary means. Wraith left no violence, no stolen money, no weapon. His crimes lived in that grey space between moral and mortal. He didn't kill like other men. He dismantled. Summer arrived with an uneasy stillness. The fields grew heavy with heat. Cicadas sang thick and slow, and yet the chill in people's stomachs remained. No one spoke Wraith's name aloud anymore. Only the sheriff, still chasing shadows with a notebook and instinct, refused to let silence win. Then came the letter. One afternoon, a boy working at the postal office delivered an envelope to the sheriff's station, addressed in the same impeccable hand that had written the anonymous note. It simply read, "An invitation for the truth still seeks courage." Inside was a card bearing only 3 words and an address, an estate on the northern edge of town that had been abandoned since the war. The message read, "Horny Friday, after dusk." Briar's pulse quickened as he folded the paper. He had spent months studying Wraith's patterns, knowing every rumor, every whisper. Now for the first time the hunter was being invited to meet the prey, or perhaps the reverse. That Friday, as the sun sank and the last orange light bled behind the trees, Briar strapped his revolver to his belt and rode out toward the old estate. The road was empty. The sound of his horse's hooves struck the dirt in slow, hollow rhythm. The air smelled of rain and something faintly metallic. When he reached the gate, he found it ajar. Inside, the grass grew wild, reclaiming stone paths. The house loomed large but lifeless, windows dead, porch sagging. And there, seated on a chair at the edge of the veranda, was Henry Wraith. He rose slowly, as if expecting Briar all along. The same black coat, the same hat, and that same unnerving calm. "Sheriff," Wraith said, tipping his hat politely, "you've been keeping an eye on me, I believe." Briar didn't answer at first. His breath came steady but slow. "I suppose that depends," he said. "Are you giving me reason to?" Wraith smiled, faint and amused. "Everyone gives reason, Sheriff. Some just take longer to notice." The 2 men stood facing each other, the lawman bound by duty and the gentleman bound by something else entirely. The sky darkened behind them, and for a moment the only sound was the faint clinking of Wraith's cane against the floorboards. "What do you want from these people?" Briar asked finally. "You've hurt them enough." "I haven't hurt anyone," Wraith replied. "I've only shown them what they already carried within. I collect nothing that isn't freely given." He stepped closer, the light catching the silver head of his cane. "Do you not see, Sheriff? They trade their peace willingly, for guilt, for vanity, for the illusion of control. I only take what they offer." Briar's jaw tightened. "And if I told you I don't believe that?" Henry's eyes hardened, the faintest edge of irritation breaking through his composed exterior. "Then you haven't paid enough attention to yourself." That night would mark the beginning of something darker than even the sheriff could comprehend, because when dawn came, Briar would remember little of what was said after that, only that he left the estate alone, his revolver untouched, and the faint echo of a voice whispering through his thoughts, "You cannot arrest a man for reflection." In the days that followed, the sheriff's notes became erratic, fragmented, as though written in haste or confusion. Words slanted off the page. He knows. They see themselves. He doesn't take life, he takes identity. Henry Wraith, meanwhile, continued to walk peacefully through town, immaculate as ever, his cane tapping in precise rhythm. And yet, for the first time, the rhythm was not alone. The summer heat thickened over Virginia like a fever, pressing against every breath and bending the air above the fields. The townsfolk spoke less now, not out of secrecy but exhaustion. Fear had settled not like a storm but like dust, quiet, constant, and impossible to sweep away. In his small office near the edge of Main Street, Sheriff Amos Briar sat with a bottle of rye and a notebook that no longer made sense. The entries he'd written over the months now read like the ramblings of a haunted man. Some pages were missing. Others were stained, the ink smeared from sweat or rain or tears. He couldn't tell anymore. He kept returning to the same line. Henry Wraith shows people to themselves. There was something inherently cruel about that thought, something so intimate it felt like confession. For every townsperson who vanished or broke apart, there was no evidence of force, no sign of violence, just these small traces of surrender. It was as if Wraith didn't need to harm anyone. He simply guided them toward whatever darkness already lived inside them. 3 weeks had passed since their meeting at the old estate, and the sheriff couldn't remember leaving the place. He remembered Wraith's calm tone, the scent of rain and a faint reflection in one of the windows, a figure standing behind Wraith that looked just like him. Or maybe it looked like Briar himself. The memory refused to settle. That morning, Briar walked to the abandoned Hale Gallery on Jefferson Street, the place where Thomas Hale, the painter, had last worked before disappearing. The building was covered in ivy now, the windows fogged from within. As the sheriff stepped through the creaking door, the smell of turpentine hit him first, sharp and stale. Dust hung in the light like mist. Inside, the walls were lined with portraits, faces from the town, people he knew. The mayor's wife, the butcher's daughter, even Martha Cray, the seamstress. Their eyes were missing, painted over in dull grey brushstrokes, all identical, and in the center of the room, propped against an easel, stood a single unfinished painting, Henry Wraith seated in a chair, staring forward as if waiting for the viewer to speak. Briar stepped closer. The signature at the bottom was clear, T. Hale, 1903. But as the sheriff's eyes adjusted, he noticed something impossible, the faint outline of another face beneath the layers of paint, a reflection emerging through the shadow. He wiped the surface gently with his thumb. His stomach tightened. It wasn't Wraith's reflection at all. It was his own. Something thudded softly behind him. Briar spun around, hand instinctively going to his revolver. But there was no one. Only the soft creak of the building as the wind pressed against its walls. And yet faintly he heard it, a sound like parchment turning. Somewhere deeper inside, another room waited. He pushed the door open and found a table covered with scattered papers. Some were sketches, others were letters written in the same precise handwriting he'd seen before. Among them lay a thick leather ledger, bound with twine, the cover scorched along one edge as if it had been rescued from a fire. The title on the first page read, "The Record of Transactions." He hesitated, then untied the ledger and turned the first leaf. The names came at once, columns upon columns written in neat script, each paired with short notes describing traits or emotions. Harlan Beatrice as guilt, Cray Martha, loneliness, Gentry Harold, pride. On and on it went. Each name had a date beside it, and a mark at the end, either a single line or a small circle. It looked like a record of trade, except the commodity being traded wasn't money. It was something far more intimate, fragments of human spirit. He reached the final pages and felt his pulse quicken. At the bottom of the list, a fresh entry caught his eye, Briar Amos Stout. The space beside it was blank, as if waiting to be completed. The room seemed to contract around him. A whisper passed through the air, so faint it could have been a thought. Every man signs his name eventually. Briar slammed the ledger shut and left at once, his hands trembling. Outside, the sun hit his face like punishment. He made his way back to town, but every reflection he passed in a window seemed to waver, as though something watched from behind the glass. Meanwhile, Henry Wraith was not hiding. He'd begun to move more freely through town again, walking the main square each evening as the lamps were being lit. People stepped aside without a word. He'd nod politely, offer a faint smile, and move on. To some it was courtesy. To others it was warning. That night, Sheriff Briar returned to his home, locked the door, and placed the ledger on his desk. He stared at it for hours. Every instinct told him to burn it, but another voice told him to read. He needed to understand what Wraith was doing, how he was keeping these people under his spell. So he read until dawn. The entries were clinical, unemotional, written like business notes. But the rhythm in Wraith's handwriting told a deeper story, an obsession with control. He categorized virtues and vices as if they were currencies. Pride weakens judgment, one page said. Desire opens confession. Regret seals the bargain. It was madness disguised as philosophy. Just before sunrise, Briar heard a knock at his door, 3 precise taps. He drew his revolver but didn't move. The knocking came again, the sound deliberate, steady. He waited, heart racing, then approached cautiously. When he opened the door, no one stood there. Only a single envelope lay at his feet, sealed in black wax. Inside was a note, short and elegant as always. "You've read enough to know the truth." The ledger doesn't just record, it replaces. Briar turned toward his mirror, the one that hung in the corner of his room. His reflection looked strange. His eyes duller, the lines around his mouth deeper. Beneath his collarbone he felt a burn, faint but real, as though something invisible had been pressed there. He pulled aside his shirt and saw a small circle, perfectly shaped ink black against the skin. The same mark from the ledger. Henry Wraith had begun to collect him. Briar stumbled back, gasping, clutching his chest. The mark didn't fade, it pulsed. The sheriff realized then that Wraith's crimes could no longer be captured in paper or logic. They lived inside the people themselves. As dawn broke, Briar made one final note in his journal, his handwriting uneven but resolute. "There's no arresting this man, only ending him. Before he ends me." But outside, Henry Wraith was already on his morning walk, hat tilted, cane in hand, smiling faintly at every passing soul, and when his reflection crossed a window pane, there were two of him now. By the time autumn began to creep back into Virginia, Sheriff Amos Briar was living on borrowed sleep. His hands trembled when he wrote, and his eyes carried that hollow sheen of someone who stayed awake longer than any man should. The mark on his chest had darkened. Sometimes it pulsed faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat, though he wasn't sure if that was real or just his mind unraveling. Henry Wraith had become quieter. That was the worst part. The calm before storms has a sound, and Roanoke was filled with it. The man no longer sought company or conversation. Instead, he disappeared for days, taking long walks into the countryside where no one followed. Each time he returned, another name quietly left the living world, someone who simply stopped existing in the town's rhythm, erasing themselves as if they'd never drawn breath there. But one person still fought to uncover what remained beneath the legend. Eleanor Price, a journalist from Richmond who'd arrived in late September, notebook in hand and fire in her tone. She was young, sharp-eyed, and unapologetically skeptical of local superstition. When she first heard of the gentleman who collected souls, she smiled at the absurdity of it. A story for drunks and widows, she thought. But when she saw the fear in the eyes of sober men, she realized this was no ordinary ghost story. There was something human here, something methodical. She sought out Sheriff Briar, though getting him to speak took patience. When he finally agreed to meet, it was at a diner just outside town late at night, when the air was cool and the lamps burned low. "You shouldn't have come here," Briar told her, his voice rough from whiskey and exhaustion. "You write about this man, you make him stronger." Eleanor frowned, clicking her pen against the table. "I don't believe in curses, Sheriff. I believe in patterns." He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Then start with this. The pattern ends with you." He handed her a small envelope sealed tight. Inside was a photo, faded, cracked at the edges, showing Henry Wraith standing in front of a grand old house halfway swallowed by vines. On the back, written in the same elegant script, were 4 words, "Ashford Hill Midnight Meeting." Eleanor leaned back, heartbeat quickening. "What's there?" Briar hesitated. "Answers. Or an ending. Maybe both." She left that night determined to find out. And because she was brave or foolish, she went alone. The road to Ashford Hill was narrow and winding, lined with trees that bent toward the path like eavesdroppers. The moon hung pale above them, casting silver light across fields of dry wheat. The house appeared slowly through the mist, a decaying mansion with wide brick steps and windows dark as wounds. Eleanor parked her carriage, grabbed her notebook, and approached. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled of earth and iron. The air was dense, unmoving. Every footstep echoed across marble floors slick with dust. She moved cautiously, her lantern flickering. Paintings lined the hallway, portraits of unfamiliar faces painted in the distinct, lifelike style of Thomas Hale. Beneath each frame, a name was etched in small silver plates. Every one of them matched someone she'd read about in Roanoke's missing person reports. At the top of the staircase, a faint melody drifted, a piano, broken and slow. A man's voice hummed along, low and steady. She followed it to the drawing room. There he was. Henry Wraith sat at the piano like a photograph come to life. The keys were yellow with age, the notes fractured, each one ringing with painful elegance. He turned ever so slightly as she entered, his smile soft, polite. "Miss Price," he said, as though expecting her. "You're punctual." "I do admire that." Her grip on the lantern tightened. "You know my name." Wraith nodded, eyes flicking toward the flame. "Names are gifts. People give them far too easily." Eleanor steadied her voice. "Whatever you're doing to these people stops tonight." Wraith's smile widened, not with joy, but with amusement. "Ah, the righteousness of youth. Tell me, Miss Price, do you believe you have never manipulated another soul? Never traded truth for comfort?" She stepped forward. "You destroy lives." "I reveal them," he corrected softly. "I simply remove the mask people wear to survive the reflection. If that destroys them, that is a confession in itself." Wraith rose then, moving closer, his height casting her in shadow. "Would you like to see what you've hidden, Eleanor?" She refused to move. Her pulse raced, but her voice held. "You don't scare me." He studied her face carefully, almost fondly. "Good," he said. "Fear spoils clarity." Then with slow precision he placed his hand against her chest. It was cold, unnaturally so. For a moment the air stilled. Eleanor's surroundings began to twist, the air tightening, the light dimming until everything around her was reflected, mirrors where walls had been, each one showing a different version of herself. In one she was older, in another she was crying, in a third she was holding her father's funeral hat. Each reflection whispered, a flood of regrets, mistakes, betrayals, all overlapping in a cacophony of memory. Her throat closed. Her knees trembled. She tried to scream, but Wraith's voice cut through it all, calm as ever. "Every truth begins with choice." Then, as suddenly as it began, the mirrors vanished. She was back in the parlor, gasping, knees on the cold floor. The lantern had fallen over but hadn't broken. Henry Wraith was gone. In his place sat her notebook, open, blank, except for one sentence written in her own handwriting. "He showed me what I already knew." Outside, dawn began to break. She stumbled out of the mansion, shaking, the notebook clutched to her chest. The fields were silent except for the wind. Back in town, Briar was waiting by the office steps when she arrived. He looked at her and knew without a word that she had seen it too. She handed him the notebook, unable to speak. He flipped through it slowly. Every page remained empty except for the last, where her scrawled words glared up at him. He understood then that the ledger wasn't the only thing that could record. Wraith had found a new way to document his work, through memories. 2 weeks later, Eleanor Price boarded a train back to Richmond. She never wrote the story. She never spoke of him again. But the sheriff knew that silence wasn't safety. It was surrender. Because that same night, as he looked out the window of his office at the quiet streets below, he saw him again, Henry Wraith standing beneath a lamppost, hat in hand, smiling faintly up at the window, waiting. By early November, the trees along the edge of Roanoke had turned brittle, skeletal. Frost shimmered on the morning grass, and every breath carried that quiet sting of winter drawing near. The town had learned to live alongside its dread, no longer loud, no longer panicked, but subdued. The kind of fear that hums under daily life, like a current only felt when silence becomes too sharp. Sheriff Amos Briar had stopped sleeping entirely. He looked like a man held together by duty and whiskey, his coat unbuttoned, his revolver always close. The mark on his chest grew darker every week, as if Wraith's ledger had been redrawn inside him. But despite the fatigue pressing against every movement, his resolve began to sharpen. Briar was done recording crimes. He wanted to stop them, and there was only one way to do it: find out how Henry Wraith chose his victims. Briar spent nights in the small reading room behind the church, poring through old records, property deeds, and medical archives from Richmond. He discovered that Wraith had once been listed as a consultant at an asylum, though not a doctor. His title simply read Observer. No papers of birth, no family, not even a place of study. Wraith appeared suddenly in 1887 in New York, and vanished just as suddenly 3 years later. But among the archives, one letter stood out, a patient's record from that very asylum, written by a Dr. Theodore Kane. Mr. Henry Wraith's presence unsettles even the inmates. He speaks of souls as if they were commerce. He keeps a book. When he visits, they confess things spontaneously, things never spoken aloud before. He leaves and their eyes lose all warmth. The ledger existed long before Roanoke. That finding pushed Briar to action. He knew Wraith couldn't simply take what wasn't freely given. Every soul he collected, was marked first by conversation, by confession. If no one confessed, Wraith could not trade. But the sheriff also understood the challenge. People always confess. And in a town buried by its own secrets, silence was not a habit. It was a lie. He decided to force a confrontation. On the night of November 10th, rain poured heavy over the valley. Briar waited inside his office until midnight. Revolver loaded, ledger on the desk, his notes scattered like fragments of a fever. Then, as if summoned by thought, the door creaked open. A figure stepped in, drenched, composed, hat dripping water onto the floorboards. "Good evening, Sheriff," Henry Wraith said, voice smooth as glass. "You've called me, have you not?" Briar didn't flinch. "Sit." Wraith smiled faintly and removed his hat, setting it carefully on the desk. "Hospitality. Always appreciated." Briar poured 2 glasses of rye. "You've done terrible things," he said quietly. "But you leave no blood, no weapon, no trail I can use." "Because I don't kill, Sheriff," Wraith said, swirling his drink before tasting it. "I only complete what's begun." "And what's begun?" Briar asked. His tone was hard now. "Doubt," Wraith replied. "Sin is born of decision. I merely carry the consequence to its end." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You make people confess things they shouldn't." "I make them honest." Briar leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Then make me honest." Wraith froze. The game shifted. "Are you certain?" "Completely." For the first time, Henry seemed unsure. He studied Briar's face with quiet intensity, as though measuring the depth of the man's conviction against the weight of his mark. Then, slowly, he extended a hand across the desk. Briar took it. What happened next cannot be described as vision or hallucination. It was memory torn open. In a flash, the sheriff saw every moment he'd failed to act. The argument with his wife before she died, when he'd chosen silence instead of apology. The friend he betrayed for a badge. The man he almost shot out of vengeance instead of duty. The faces blurred, folded, vanished. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a mirror. Wraith spoke softly. "You seek justice, but you crave absolution." Briar's voice cracked. "I just want peace." "Then give me your burden," Wraith whispered. The sheriff gripped the table so tight his knuckles whitened. Sweat pulsed through his neck. He realized Wraith's offer wasn't metaphor. It was literal. The ledger was expanding. A faint line had appeared beneath his name. If he agreed, if he surrendered whatever guilt weighed him down, Wraith would take it. But in doing so, take him. Briar looked him dead in the eyes. "You don't get to decide who deserves peace." Wraith smiled gently. "No, they do." Thunder cracked outside. The lights flickered. The rain sounded like applause. Wraith rose calmly and placed the empty glass back on the desk. "You're stronger than I expected," he said softly. "Not pure, but resistant. I'll return when your doubts call again." He turned and walked toward the door, cane striking the floor rhythmically. Briar's heartbeat followed the sound like a drum. When Wraith reached the threshold, he paused. "One last thing," he said, turning slightly. "Do you believe you've saved those souls I've taken?" Briar narrowed his eyes. "No, but I'll die trying." Wraith bowed his head lightly, the faintest trace of sadness crossing his face. "Then we understand each other." He stepped out into the rain and vanished. That night marked the shift, the first time Wraith failed to collect. But the sheriff didn't celebrate. He knew this wasn't victory. It was invitation. Wraith thrived on unfinished bargains, on what remained unresolved. By dawn, Briar burned the ledger. The flames rose quick, devouring ink and paper until the last remains curled to ash. The mark on his chest throbbed violently. Then, for a single breath, it faded. The sheriff fell to his knees, exhausted, trembling. He whispered something to himself, half prayer, half defiance. No one in Roanoke saw Henry Wraith again for nearly a month, but December brought something the town couldn't ignore. Every mirror inside the church shattered simultaneously, as if struck from within. And beneath the broken glass, someone found a single silver coin. Engraved upon it were 3 words: "The bargain holds." December fell hard over Virginia that year. Frost gripped the fields like glass, and snow gathered on rooftops, muting the small world of Roanoke under its cold weight. The townsfolk moved slower now, wrapped in heavy coats and heavier thoughts. The nights were longer, the air sharper, and the sound of the wind seemed to carry names that no one dared to answer. After the fire that consumed Henry Wraith's ledger, Sheriff Amos Breyer tried to return to a semblance of normal life. He patrolled the empty streets, checked the tavern for trouble, nodded politely at those who still looked him in the eye. But beneath the surface, something inside him had shifted. The mark on his chest no longer burned, yet a cold space lived where warmth used to be. Sleep came rarely, peace never. The townspeople saw him differently too, half hero, half madman. Some claimed he'd defeated the gentleman in black, that whatever curse lingered had been broken. Others whispered he'd bargained for the town's safety at the cost of his soul. Either way, no one dared ask him directly. In Roanoke, questions had consequences. Then came the silence. On December 21st, the church bells refused to ring. The rope was still there, uncut, the mechanism unbroken, but when the townsfolk tried to pull, the bell wouldn't sound. They said it felt heavy, as though the air itself was pressing down. That same morning, children stopped speaking. They'd open their mouths, lips forming words, but nothing came out. By evening, more than 20 people across Roanoke had lost their voices. The doctor called it hysteria brought on by fear. The pastor called it punishment. Breyer called it what it was: Henry Wraith's return. He spent the next 2 days walking through the snow, retracing the places where Wraith had once been seen: the butcher's shop, the old Hale Gallery, Martha Cray's abandoned seamstress store. Everywhere he went, the mirrors had been covered or broken. He began to notice a pattern. Wherever silence struck, reflections had vanished. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor Price returned. She had been in Richmond for 3 months, unable to write, unable to forget. But when she heard of Roanoke's strange affliction, her conscience dragged her back. The woman looked changed, older, sharper around the eyes, yet still composed. She found Breyer outside the old church, staring up at the frozen bell tower. "You were right," she said softly, pulling her coat tighter. "He's not gone." Breyer's gaze didn't move from the tower. "He doesn't leave. He waits." They spoke in low tones as snow drifted through the wind. Eleanor showed him her notebook, the same one she had brought from Ashford Hill. Though blank for months, new words had begun to appear on their own, faint and shifting like breath on glass. She held it out for him to see. The latest sentence read, "Winter buries nothing. It only preserves." Breyer exhaled through his teeth. "Then he's still collecting," Eleanor nodded. "But not through confession anymore. Through silence." "What do you mean?" "He's taken their voices," she whispered. "He's recording them differently. Absence is part of his ledger now." They stood there in the snow, the realization slowly sinking in. Wraith had evolved. Burning the ledger hadn't destroyed him. It had freed him from paper. Now, every silence, every unspoken fear, every memory left unsaid fed whatever remained of him. That night, as the town slept under a pale moon, Eleanor and Breyer searched for any sign of him. They wandered through the alleys and the shuttered homes until near Jefferson Street. They noticed it, a faint glow from behind the window of the old Hale Gallery, the same place where Breyer had first found the painted faces. The door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the frost crawling across the walls like veins. There, in the center of the room, stood Henry Wraith, exactly as before, as immaculate as the day he disappeared. His coat was free of snow, his hair untouched by age. Only his eyes looked different, darker, deeper, bottomless. "Sheriff, Miss Price," he greeted almost kindly. His voice echoed not through the air but through thought, soundless yet unmistakable. "You've returned to finish what you began." Eleanor stepped forward, trembling though she tried to hide it. "What do you want from us?" Wraith tilted his head slightly. "What I've always wanted. Integrity. By silencing an entire town," Breyer growled. "They silenced themselves long before I came. I only helped them listen." He raised one gloved hand. Frost coiled upward from the floor, encircling his feet. Behind him, the painted portraits began to change, the eyes reappearing, alive and moving. Faces blinked. Lips twitched in silent pleas. "These people were trapped," Wraith continued. "Now they endure, free from the noise of the lies they once spoke." "They're not free," Eleanor said firmly. "They're prisoners." Wraith's expression softened almost sadly. "Freedom frightens those who've never used their voice truthfully." Breyer's hand hovered near his revolver. "You think this is redemption?" "I know it is balance," Wraith replied. "Every truth carries its debt. I only collect what truth leaves behind. In that moment, Briar's restraint broke. He drew his revolver, pointing it straight at Wraith's chest. "If you collect debts, collect this." Wraith didn't move. His gaze flicked downward for the briefest second, then back to Briar's eyes. "You think bullets can pierce reflection?" He stepped forward, walking directly into the barrel of the gun. The fume from Briar's breath clouded between them. "Go ahead, Sheriff. Complete the bargain." Briar fired. The sound cracked through the gallery like thunder, echoing down the empty streets. But when the smoke cleared, Wraith remained standing. The bullet had passed through him. No wound, no blood, only a faint ripple as though he were more concept than flesh. He smiled faintly, almost admiringly. "You still believe in the tangible. That's why you'll never end me." The frost overtook the walls entirely now, crawling toward Eleanor and Briar's feet. The air tightened, freezing in their lungs. Then Wraith lowered his voice to a whisper, one that neither of them would later remember hearing, though its meaning would linger. "When a man loses his voice, his soul becomes mine. Ask yourself, Sheriff, how long since you've truly spoken your heart?" The frost exploded outward in a burst of cold light. When Briar woke, he was lying on the steps outside the gallery. The building behind him was empty again, windows shattered, every painting gone. Eleanor lay beside him, unconscious but breathing. Her notebook rested in the snow, open to a blank page save for one line written in neat cursive. "The winter listens." Briar rose slowly, staring back at the building. His revolver still smoked, the barrel iced white. Henry Wraith was gone once more, but Roanoke had fallen utterly silent. The town had become a mirror of itself. For the first time, even Briar dared not speak. January 1904 arrived under a blanket of grey. Snow buried the streets, muffling the world into a whisper that never lifted. Roanoke had become a ghost town of the living, a place where every face avoided every other, and the silence was too deep to be natural. The town clock had stopped on the stroke of 12 days before New Year's Eve, and had not moved since. Sheriff Amos Briar was the only sound left. His boots crunched over frozen roads, his breath leaving brief ghosts in the air. He patrolled out of habit more than duty now, checking doors, empty homes, places that once felt alive, but were now hollow bones of a town that no longer breathed. Every morning, he wrote one line in his notebook, a ritual he didn't even question anymore. Each entry began the same way. "He's still here." He no longer needed to see Henry Wraith to feel him. The presence hung everywhere, in reflections, in the hushed eyes of mothers, in the stillness of the church where the bell no longer rang. Wraith had become part of the silence itself. Eleanor Price rarely left her room at the boarding house. Since the night of the frost, her voice had weakened to a trembling whisper. She told herself she would leave Roanoke, board a train, and never return. But each day when she reached the station, something invisible turned her back. It wasn't fear. It was the pull of an unfinished story, an ache demanding resolution. On the 12th night of the new year, Briar knocked on her door. She opened it quietly. His eyes were red, his face drawn. The mark beneath his collar glowed faintly in the dark, like embers dying slow. "He's in the church," Briar said. "He's waiting for me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "You can't go alone." "I've been alone since this started," he said softly, then looked at her, his voice lowering. "But if he's ending this through confession, maybe that's what I need to give him." She shook her head in disbelief. "You think confessing will stop him?" "I think silence gave him power," Briar replied. "Maybe truth can take it back." An hour later, the two of them walked through the snow toward the church at the edge of town. The stained glass windows glowed faintly with the light of candles flickering inside. No smoke rose from the chimney. No prints but their own marked the way. When they stepped in, the air felt alive like the aftermath of thunder. The pews were empty, the altar draped in frost, and beneath the broken bell rope stood Henry Wraith, perfectly still. His hands folded behind his back, he turned to them slowly. His smile just enough to remind them he was still human, or had once been. "Sheriff," Wraith began calmly, "you've come to offer me something." Briar kept his stance, his revolver lowered but ready. "You said no one escapes their reflection. So here I am. Take mine," Eleanor whispered sharply. "Don't—" But her voice fractured. Wraith's gaze shifted toward her, gentle yet unbearably heavy. "The chronicler," he mused. "Every story requires a witness." He stepped closer to Briar, the cane tapping lightly against stone. "What is it you wish to confess?" Briar's voice trembled but did not falter. "That I let good people die because I was too proud to see past procedure. That I buried my guilt behind the badge." He took a breath that scraped his throat raw. "That I was afraid of losing control, of being wrong, of being no better than the men I arrested." Wraith tilted his head. "And now? Now I'd trade anything to silence you?" The words struck the air like a whip. Wraith blinked slowly, studying him. "Then perhaps we are not so different, Sheriff." The Clark light from the windows dimmed. The frost on the altar began to crawl outward again, coating the floor, climbing the pews. Wraith spread his arms slightly as though welcoming the end. "Speak freely," he said softly. "Your truth is the door." Eleanor stepped forward suddenly, her voice trembling back to life. "No, that's how he wins. Every confession becomes his claim. Every truth another mark in his ledger." She turned to Briar, eyes wild with urgency. "Don't give him anything more." Wraith's face remained serene. "It is not giving. It is release." "Release into what?" she demanded. "To the quiet," he whispered, his tone almost kind. "Where suffering ceases." The frost reached their feet. Eleanor shivered violently, her breath pluming in sharp bursts. She looked at Briar, whose grip on the revolver had begun to loosen. His eyes were clouding, not from fear but weariness, the kind that existed deeper than flesh. Eleanor made a choice. She stepped between them, her voice steady despite the cold. "If confession is what you seek, then take mine." Wraith turned toward her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You?" "Yes," she said. "I came here to expose you, to write your truth. But the truth I've run from is simpler." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wasn't investigating you out of duty. I was looking for a story to make me feel alive again. I used your horror to fill my own emptiness." Wraith's expression softened. "Honesty," he murmured. "At last." Then he stepped closer and touched her cheek. The air stilled. The frost around them began to vibrate with faint light. Briar tried to reach for her, but Wraith's presence pinned him in place, not physical, but like gravity bending around despair. "Every confession carries an exchange," Wraith said, voice almost affectionate. "Are you certain you offer this freely?" Eleanor met his stare without wavering. "If taking it means the town is free, then yes." He smiled faintly, a curator closing a final page. "So be it." The moment his hand passed over her chest, the frost melted. The light dimmed, and just like that, Wraith was gone. No flash, no scream, only the lingering echo of silence collapsing into still air. Eleanor collapsed to the floor. The sheriff caught her before she hit the stone. Her pulse beat weakly beneath his fingers. "Eleanor," he said roughly, shaking her. "Say something." Her lips parted, and in the faintest whisper she said, "It's over." The candles around them flickered, then steadied. The air in the church warmed slightly, the kind of warmth that felt final, like dawn slipping into a nightmare. For the first time in months, the church bells rang again on their own, clear and sharp, cutting through the valley. Henry Wraith was gone. The mark on Briar's chest faded completely, but the cost was inked elsewhere now, in Eleanor's pale stillness, in the peace that looked too quiet to be comforting. When morning came, Briar carried her outside as snow began to fall again. The sound of life started to return to Roanoke, voices murmuring, doors opening, the faint relief of sound filling the void. The town would recover, it always did. But as the sheriff looked down at Eleanor's notebook, lying open where she'd dropped it, he saw one new sentence written across the blank page in neat, black ink. "Every silence must have a voice." Her pulse steadied then, faint but present. Her eyes opened, and in them, for the briefest heartbeat, reflected in the winter light, was a shade of grey that did not belong to her. Spring came late to Virginia that year. The snow melted reluctantly, leaving behind roads lined with mud and branches stripped bare. When the first green began to touch the valley again, Roanoke awoke as if from a long illness, quiet, uncertain, afraid to trust the sound of its own heartbeat. Children's laughter returned first, timid and scattered. The church bells rang every morning. People began to speak aloud again as though testing their voices for fractures, but not everything melted with the frost. Sheriff Amos Briar grew slower, older. His hair had streaks of grey now, his hands always trembling slightly. He still patrolled, still walked the same route through the square, though no one expected him to. There was peace, at least the kind that lives on the surface. Beneath it, he carried silence like a scar under his ribs. Eleanor Price recovered, though the recovery did not come easily. The whispers followed her, the ones that said she'd bargained with Henry Wraith, that she'd taken his place by choice or by curse. Her voice returned, but not as it had been. There was an undertone to it now, something melodic and haunting that no one could explain. When she spoke, people often paused, listening longer than intended, as if the echo of her words lingered after her lips stopped moving. Briar visited her often at the boarding house where she stayed, notebook always in hand, wary of what the world still owed them. The two shared quiet, steady companionship, the kind that required no explanation. They knew what they carried. On the first Sunday of May, they sat together outside the church steps, watching the people gather for morning service. Sunlight shimmered off the stained glass, no longer broken. The air smelled of lilacs and wet grass. It should have felt like deliverance. "You think it's really over?" Eleanor asked softly. Briar didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the street, where a man in a dark coat crossed the square, his stride calm, measured. The sheriff's jaw tensed, fingers brushing his revolver out of old habit. But when the man looked up, it wasn't Henry Wraith, just another traveler, just another reflection of memory. He exhaled slowly. "Some things don't end," he said. "Do they wait?" Eleanor lowered her gaze to the notebook resting on her lap. Almost without thought, she opened it. The pages were blank again, though every few seconds faint ripples stirred across the surface, like ink moving beneath water. She had burned it once, tried to destroy it, yet it always returned to her luggage, whole, patient, a reminder or a warning. "Do you ever wonder what he wanted?" she asked. Briar glanced at her. "Power. Control." She shook her head. "No, I think he wanted permanence." "To matter," the sheriff sighed. Well, he got it. For months, life continued quietly. The town repaired its shops, marriages resumed, crops grew again, sermons grew louder. People stopped whispering about Henry Wraith and began to call the year of silence a shared nightmare. But history is never erased, merely rewritten with gentler words. By midsummer, Eleanor decided to leave. She packed her belongings, including the notebook wrapped in cloth, and bought a ticket north. The morning she left, Sheriff Briar walked her to the train station. The mist hung low, catching the light in soft waves. Neither spoke much during the walk. When the train whistle sounded, she turned to him. "If he returns—" "You'll know," Briar said, "because you'll feel the quiet before anyone hears it." She nodded, board in hand, eyes steady on his. "And if he doesn't? Then you tell the story," he said, "even if no one believes it." As the train pulled away, the sheriff tipped his hat. The wind carried her voice faintly through. The departing smoke, a soft goodbye that shimmered through the air longer than any echo should. That night, Briar sat inside his office, alone again. The lantern burned low, casting gold across his desk. He stared at the empty chair across from him, the one Henry Wraith had once sat in during their long conversation over rye and rain. On the wall behind it, the reflection of the flame shifted slightly, forming two silhouettes instead of one. He didn't move. "You're still chasing ghosts," came a voice behind him. Briar smiled faintly. "I thought you rested." "Rest is a mortal word," the voice replied. He turned, expecting to face the man once again, but instead on the empty chair sat the sheriff's own reflection, alive in the mirror's glass. It smiled without malice, only awareness. "You burned the pages," it said, "but fire doesn't undo the ink." Briar's voice was low. "Then what does?" "Acceptance." And with that, the reflection dissolved, leaving only Briar's tired face staring back. Outside, the wind softened. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells rang again, steady and clear. For the first time, their sound didn't ache. It reminded him of heartbeat, of continuity. He took off his hat, placed it on the desk, and reached for the ledger of his own, a fresh notebook. The pencil hovered above the first line. He began to write, his hand trembling but sure. This is the story of Henry Wraith, the man who collected souls, and of those who learned that silence itself can speak. The last candle burned low, smoke curling upward like the ghost of unfinished conversation. Then darkness took the room. Weeks passed. Eleanor arrived in Baltimore, where she began to write again. The newspapers published her columns on truth and morality, her style quiet yet commanding. She never mentioned Roanoke directly, but her words often returned to the same refrain, that fear is only the shadow of reflection, and truth once spoken never dies. One evening, as she prepared her papers by lamplight, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor outside her room. Steady, rhythmic, familiar. 3 slow taps, 1 pause, 3 again. Her pen froze mid-sentence. She looked toward the door, heart still but calm. The footsteps stopped, and then through the quiet came a polite knock. She didn't move right away. Wind pressed against the window, setting the flame dancing. She exhaled once, steady, deliberate, and closed the notebook before her. It was blank again, save for one fresh line that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for your honesty." She smiled faintly. "Rest now, Henry," she whispered. The knocking stopped. Outside, the city lights blinked in the soft rain. Somewhere far behind the horizon, Roanoke slept soundly at last. Its silence no longer haunted, merely human. And so ended the tale of Henry Wraith, the gentleman who collected souls. A story not of possession nor of haunting, but of the unbearable need for truth in a world built on silence. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.